Sri Aurobindo's involvement with the Upanishads is earlier than his engagement with the Veda. Sri Aurobindo began reading and translating the Upanishads from the time that he came to Baroda. And one may see that he was following the Western idea of the Upanishads as being India's primary wisdom texts. It is only later, as we saw earlier, that he came upon the Veda and saw its importance in the Indian tradition as the source wisdom text from which even the Upanishads are derived. But in his early relations with the Indian wisdom tradition, it is really the Upanishads and the Gita that he began studying and translating even from the time in Baroda. He continued his studies in the Upanishads in his Calcutta phase and wrote a number of essays and translations. Today he has these have been published in 2 volumes called the Upanishads in Sri Aurobindo's writings. But all his work on the Upanishads have not been preserved. Some of it got destroyed when he moved from from Calcutta to Pondicherry. So what we have now are the remnants of his studies in the Upanishads. But if we look at his work, we find that there are a number of ideas of the Upanishads that he affirmed very strongly in his works. And so our look at the Upanishads today will include consideration of the primary features of the Upanishads. And as we do that, I will also talk about how some of these features enter into Sri Aurobindo's own work. At the outset, I'd like to mention a few of the Upanishads that really meant something important for Sri Aurobindo. The most important of the Upanishads to him was the Isha Upanishad. He started writing a commentary on the Isha Upanishad called The Life Divine and abandoned it at a certain point and then expanded on that to become the tome that we know as his magnum opus of philosophical writing, expressing his own views, philosophical views, in the Life Divine. So evidently he based his notion of the Life Divine on a certain reading of the Isha Upanishad. Other Upanishads that have been central to his writing, one may question whether he derived his ideas from these or found resonance in these ideas with experiences and intuitions that he himself had. The other really important Upanishad is the Taittiriya Upanishad. Now, he wrote another extended commentary on the Kena Upanishad that actually shows us some directions into another Upanishad on which he did not write so extensively, though he translated a good part of it, and that is the Aitareya Upanishad. So we look at some of these and we look at the principal ideas of the Upanishads. Now, the term Upanishad literally means to sit near. And historically, we may say that this class or body of texts represents a late Vedic period. If we consider the Rig Veda as the exemplar of the Vedic period, starting from around the 9th or 8th century BCE. And one may surmise from these texts that they represent a certain kind of a deviation from the Veda, though they are also in relation to the Veda. So there are 2 possible sources that connect these texts to the Veda. Upanishad, as I pointed out, literally means to sit near. And it refers to two different things. One, the most exoteric understanding would be the practice of a intimate circle of initiates that share knowledge in an oral culture. So that would be sitting near of the teacher and the students. Another way of thinking about sitting near is the kind of language that is used in the Upanishads. The Upanishads have been called proto-philosophic texts, and essentially they use a bare-bone language that in a sense is paradoxical, but at the same time is intellectual. So they represent a kind of language that is trying to voice a closeness to the truth in its language itself. So what we find is that towards the end of the 9th century, there is very possibly a kind of reform movement that arises out of Vedic society. And we saw how some of the later Vedas, 10th mandala stanzas, such as the hymn to the Purusha Sukta, result in a stratification of society. And it is very possible to imagine that the stratification included a collusion between the forces of knowledge and the forces of power, or Brahmins and Kshatriyas, to subjugate the rest of the society. Now, we can't be sure of this, but it is very possible that this led to a class of initiates that wanted to voice or reinvent the ideas of the Veda in such a way that they were no longer corruptible by mediators such as priests, who took on a kind of a power position in society based on the ritual aspect of the Veda. So if this really happened, then this would begin a sort of a flowering of peripheral societies of wandering initiates that would leave society and form these outskirt hermitages or wandering communities that would create a new kind of language and a new kind of voicing of the truth, a new kind of exercises or spiritual inquiries as well. So we take this to be the Upanishad. I mentioned there may be two origins. One is this, and the other is what is more traditionally accepted, which is that the Veda itself is divided into, as we saw earlier in the lecture on the Veda, that there is a stratification of the stages of life to that of the student, brahmacharya, the householder, grihastha, and the person who took retreats or retreated for periods of time into the forest to prepare for a plunge into spiritual pursuits. And so that was the vanaprastha, the movement to the forest of vana, aranya, aranya meaning forest. And so aranyakas are a class of Vedic texts that deal with this kind of social life, which is supposed to be related to a stage of life and is also part of the Vedic corpus. So one idea is that it is these aranyakas that are the beginnings of the Upanishads. And the two oldest Upanishads are the Brihadaranyaka and the Chandogya Upanishad. And particularly the Brihadaranyaka in its very name shows itself to be one of the Aranyakas. Later, these texts might have been collated with other texts belonging to this kind of an outcast society or peripheral society to form a class of texts by themselves called the Upanishads. Now, we find, if you think about the features of the Upanishads, in the Veda we found that there were no icons as such, but there were rituals, and the rituals used geometric designs and numerology and objects and various sequences of action, of offering, sacrifice. But in the Upanishads also there are no icons and there are also no rituals, so that there is the absence of any mediator in a kind of a collective sense or any privilege given to rituals to achieve spiritual goals or collective ends. As I mentioned, the voice of the Upanishads is quasi-philosophical instead of metaphorical and poetic as with the Veda. We also find that instead of the henotheism and symbolic extension of the solar godhead into a number of gods, there is a different kind of approach to the world of the deities. The deities of the Veda in the Upanishads make an appearance off and on, particularly in some very critical points in these Upanishads. But by and large, we don't have much credence given to deities, but we find a new principle known as Brahman, which takes on the aspect of a conscious divine being. So in other words, the supreme divine of the Veda is now replaced by Brahman. However, Brahman in its definition has a slightly different kind of connotation than the idea of a supreme divine in the Veda, which as we saw, is more like a solar godhead. The solar godhead of the Veda can be thought of as a Gnostic godhead, a symbol of gnosis, the sun as a symbol of gnosis, the symbol of gnosis as a gathering together of the infinity of being into a center that can be thought of as the presence of the one that is the only one there is. However, this kind of a centrality given to the one is not primarily voiced by the Upanishads. One may say that it exists, but it is made into a secret, or it is made into a non-obvious reality. Brahman in itself is more like the principle of being. If we take the same metaphor that we used earlier of reality as a circumference-less circle, then Brahman is that circumference-less circle. It exists everywhere. It is omnipresent, it is omnipotent, and it is omniscient. Its omniscience is spread, and though it is centralized, that centrality is given a name which is a subsidiary aspect of Brahman. It's not made into the primary name of the divine. And one may speculate why that's the case. My own speculation on that fact is that in this transition from a society that is mirroring the notion of the sun and its planets, becoming a kind of society which is hierarchical, we now have a disavowal of that, and the notion of a decentralized, infinite spread, a reality that is equally available, a university, as one might call it, instead of a symbolic center to the entire cosmos and reality. So that is Brahman. And also we find that there are two realms in the Upanishads. The two realms of the Veda, the heliocentric and the geocentric realm, are now seen as the realms of knowledge and ignorance. This distinction is carried most powerfully in the Isha Upanishad. Knowledge is called Vidya and ignorance Avidya. Now, I'd like to mention that as texts that belong to a vast oral tradition, these Upanishads only crystallize the knowledge of the society, the Vedantic society, Upanishadic society. And each Upanishad, therefore, assumes many things that it does not mention. And the ideas that we are talking about do not make their appearance in all the Upanishads. For example, as I said, Vidya and Avidya make a prominent appearance in the Isha Upanishad, but in several other Upanishads they are only mentioned in passing or not even mentioned. The term Brahman, however, is one of those ubiquitous terms. It's almost a defining term for this body of literature. Now we find going on that knowledge of Vidya has three parts that are known in later literature as Sat, Chit and Ananda, or existence, consciousness and bliss. Ignorance also has three parts: Annam, Prana and Mana, or matter, life and mind, and we can see the parallels with the case of the Veda. This divisioning of ignorance into kinds of consciousness and of knowledge into kinds of consciousness as well is prominently achieved in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Between these two zones, there is a link principle. This link principle is called Vijnana, and Sri Aurobindo translates it as supermind. This is the Gnostic principle for Sri Aurobindo. This is probably what would equate for the solar consciousness of the Veda. So we find that it exists, but it is given a kind of more hidden existence in the Upanishads. So knowledge is made to appear as ignorance through Brahman's power, which is called Maya. So now we find Maya. Maya as a term makes its first appearances in the Veda. Maya is like a magical power. And we find that the most explicit use of the word Maya in the Upanishads occurs in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. And it is Brahman's power, like a magic power, magician power, and allows knowledge to become veiled and appear as the ignorance. The notion of knowledge and ignorance, as we saw earlier, are these two hemispheres. The realm of knowledge is one in which all is known. It's the heliocentric realm. All is known by its own light. There is no duality there. There is only the one and its own self-formulations that recognize themselves to be the formulations of the one. While ignorance is the realm of dualities, which move in alternations without affirming either one of them as the supreme truth. And so this kind of transition in consciousness occurs through the power of Maya in the Upanishads. The realm of ignorance, which includes the human, has manifested the three lower aspects in a discontinuous form. So this is the notion of the kinds of consciousness. And Sri Aurobindo uses this divisioning of the Taittiriya Upanishad, but he also adds to it the modern evolutionary understanding of the fact of emergent properties. Matter has no life in it to start with, but at a certain point, difference in kind of consciousness emerges within it, and that is the life principle. And then within the life principle, a new difference in kind of consciousness appears, and that's the mind principle. So these principles have discontinuous forms. These are, however, also Brahman, because there is nothing but the Brahman. The Brahman has expressed itself through limitations of consciousness. So either you have in the Vidya the Brahman in its native state with its qualities, or you have Brahman which has limited itself by a kind of a self-limitation to express certain striated forms of consciousness or quality. The three realms in the realm of knowledge are fully conscious, as we mentioned. Hence, the aim of the Upanishad becomes to rise out of the ignorance to the knowledge. This becomes the human being finds itself in the geocentric realm, just like in the Veda. The human being then lights the fire, which is the presence of the solar godhead within the earthly realm, and invokes the power of the heavenly fire, which is the power of thundering power of Indra and the gods, to help in releasing the solar power that is hidden in the earth and removing the darkness in consciousness. So that becomes the Vedic metaphor that here is seen in a more impersonal way as the aim of rising out of the ignorance to the knowledge. Now this can mean one of two goals, and we find that Sri Aurobindo locates the fact that the Upanishads are equivocal. They're not unambiguous about the goal. They have two goals. One is escape from the ignorance, which can be called moksha, and the other is transformation of the ignorance, which is jivan mukti, of freedom within life. And so we find, for example, the Isha Upanishad is the most powerful jivan mukti text among these Upanishads. The link principle of Vijnana, which is what Sri Aurobindo calls supermind and sometimes calls a causal consciousness or idea or ideal consciousness, allows us to transform the ignorance to the knowledge. So this is the divine idea, what Sri Aurobindo calls the real idea, or reality as idea, or idea as reality, whichever way you want to look at it. This aspect of the Brahman, which allows the symbols of the Brahman, the truths of the Brahman, to be expressed in symbolic form as ideas, real ideas, ideas of reality, present in a manifestation, are what we experience. But we experience these in a veiled fashion. But if we can contact this power which has created these symbols and brought them into the ken of manifestation, then we can mobilize that power to transform the ignorance back to knowledge. In other words, to reveal the truth of the symbol within the symbol. So that is the power of Vijnana, and that is partly what is being discussed in the Isha Upanishad. The bliss consciousness is the source of all creation. And this is, we find, a major difference between the Upanishadic understanding and Buddha's first noble truth, which is that of dukkha or suffering. Here we find the Taittiriya Upanishad affirming, out of Ananda all is born, by Ananda it is maintained, and into Ananda it returns. That is, bliss becomes the foundation of all things, and that is what actually maintains all things, and everything returns into that. So these are this idea is in the Taittiriya. The idea of knowledge and ignorance and of Vijnana, the supramental principle, are in the Isha Upanishad. These two are two of the most important Upanishads that Sri Aurobindo discovered and used. The early Upanishads, Brihadaranyaka and Chandogya, as we've mentioned, speak about the Brahman. They also introduce the notion of negative theology or apophatic theology. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad introduces a very interesting figure called Yajnavalkya. Often it is attributed to Yajnavalkya as a text, and this figure proposes this kind of a method of arriving at the self, capital S, of all things. The self is given the name Atman. Atman is the individuation of Brahman. So we find that to get to that, there is a process of progressive negation. It is not this, it is not this. So we keep going back till the remainder is going to be the Atman, the true self. So it introduces this kind of idea. It also introduces the idea of meditation, contemplation. It introduces the idea of mantra, and it introduces the idea of prana, or the breath, as a source to arrive at the root of life. Another very important Upanishad that Sri Aurobindo translated partly is the Katha Upanishad, and this may be a slightly later Upanishad. It compiles many things from the past, but also it is very influential to later texts like the Gita. The Katha Upanishad is the first Indian text that uses the word yoga, and it means it is used in the sense of yoking of the senses, the intelligence, and the soul. Katha Upanishad also introduces the idea of the soul which reincarnates. And another Upanishad speaks about this notion of kinds of consciousness in a different way, in terms of the waking consciousness, the dreaming consciousness, the sleeping consciousness, and the supreme trance, the trance which has no content. I mean, you cannot give it any name. See, so these four states are talked about in the Mandukya Upanishad. The methods that are developed by the Upanishads include mantra or dhyana, which is texts which are have power, verses which have power, but they are not only recited blindly but also contemplated. The Upanishads ridicule the idea of mantras which are recited without contemplation. They also introduce the idea of the bija mantra or seed mantra, the most important of which is Om. The mantra can also be a sentence, like an idea that one repeats until it becomes real to one. So these are called Mahavakyas, and these Mahavakyas are usually related to the Brahman. So there is a famous one, Sarvam Khaluvidam Brahman. All this is the Brahman. This particular Mahavakya was used by Sri Aurobindo in the Alipur jail when he was trying to stabilize the experience of Brahman that he was having at the time. Mantra can also be a paradox. The Isha Upanishad includes a number of paradoxical mantras. For example, the one unmoving is swifter than thought. So this is like a koan, and it puts you in touch with something that the mind cannot make sense of, but in approaching it, it's an aporia that pushes the mind across the border and makes it experience something beyond rational thought. It also introduces, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad introduces a triple method for meditation, which is also based on that oral culture to which the Upanishads belong, a culture of initiation. So it's called Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, and they literally mean hearing, reflecting, and entering into union. The notion is that one hears the word of power, and one cogitates on it, and at a certain point that becomes the reality. One stops thinking about it, it becomes so much a fabric of one's life, and then one comes to identity with it. And as we also saw, another form of meditation is the process of progressive negation, or neti neti. Other methods of the Upanishads include the focus on prana or breath, which is often equated with the Brahman. And the Upanishads introduce 5 kinds of breath: prana, apana, udana, vyana, and samana. These will be mentioned in the record of yoga. Now, these breaths are related to breathing exercises or pranayama, but Sri Aurobindo will follow some later texts like the texts of Raja Yoga to say that the power of mental vision cultivated and made more powerful, strengthened through meditation, arrives at a control over the pranas, because it can actually see the pranas and their movements and control them from a state of internal perception. And so that kind of control over the pranas is also an aspect of yoga. And he was doing that. Another method of the Upanishad is memory, and trying to arrive at new forms of memory or deep forms of memory. And depth memory goes down to the memory of the reincarnating element within us, which is often equated with the soul or fire. So this fire, we can see, has an outer and an inner expression. Not only is fire the presence of the sun on earth in a gross or material form, but that presence is also lit within the creatures of the earth, particularly in human beings, as a kind of psychic fire. And that psychic fire carries the memory of the earth as an inborn intuition. Another method of the Upanishads is bliss, and we saw how Soma gives rise to a whole class of practices in the Rig Veda. Here, the class of practices connected with bliss are called Madhu Vidya, or the knowledge of honey. It includes the contemplation of the origin of all things as being excellence or hita, or bliss, or ananda. Now we move on to another corpus of texts and yogic practices that Sri Aurobindo makes use of, and that is Sankhya. And another practice which is related to Sankhya but uses also its metaphysical frame, that is the school of yoga. My own speculation is that these texts arise around 500 BCE, 500 to 200 BCE, And I arrive at that because the kind of language they use is a language of enumeration. Just as Upanishad literally means to sit near and therefore explicates the social conditions of its production as being that of the initiate community that sat close in intimate circles. Sankhya has a literal term meaning enumeration, and therefore similarly points to a pedagogical method which is universal. In other words, anything that can be numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., gives us a sequential approach to the truth, an algorithm towards the truth. And these algorithmic processes are processes of pedagogy. They allow a truth to become available to all the people, to become universal, to not need a initiatic circle. And hence they represent a new move in terms of social expression. And so my sense is that a later phase arises from the Upanishads from about the 5th or 6th century BC, to which also Gautama Buddha belongs. And during this time, there is a return to the polis. And this return to the polis occurs through enumeration, but it also occurs through an empiricism. Just like the Upanishads can be thought of as a transcendentalism, that one talks about Brahman and shows the way to Brahman. The more universal method of Sankhya or of the Buddha is an empiricism where one does not talk about anything beyond but about the conditions of life itself and gives a enumerated sequence of steps to get out of the condition of unhappiness in which one might find oneself in life. So one may think of this as a pragmatic philosophy. It reaches larger numbers, and it could be also thought of as an urban reformism. Just as the Vedic reformism of the Upanishads is achieved by creating a new kind of language and a new kind of society, this is a infiltration back into the social sphere with another new kind of language. It turns the oral tradition into impersonal pedagogy through enumeration or Sankhya, and the roots of empiricism following the apophatic method of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is not this, not this. So today we think of Sankhya as related to the sage Patanjali, and Patanjali is today thought of as somebody from around the 5th or 6th century CE. There is a Patanjali who is a grammarian from the 2nd century BC, but this is more likely a later Patanjali. And this person, is evidently not the same originator of Sankhya and Yoga, but a codifier of Sankhya and Yoga at a slightly later stage. But we are surmising that the same ideas or very similar ideas are continuing from this earlier period. The essence of the Sankhya can be seen as a dualistic relationship between consciousness and the automatisms of nature. Pure consciousness is called Purusa, and the automatisms of nature may be called Prakruti. And the idea is that in our experience, we can reduce our experience, the phenomenology of our experience, to a conscious experiencer, and a set of processes through which it experiences. In fact, this kind of way of talking may even be thought to be quite close to Husserlian phenomenology, whose transcendental reduction of Husserlian phenomenology sounds very similar to this attempt to extract consciousness of the experiencer from the processes that allow phenomena to be experienced. And we can see this chart gives us a certain, outline of the way in which what is called the inner instrument or antakarana of the subjective being experiences reality. So Sankhya is attributed to a sage called Kapila. The best known text is the Sankhya Karika, attributed to Ishvara Krishna of circa 4th century. I showed Patanjali, but Patanjali is really the teacher of yoga, which is based on Sankhya. That's the reason why we showed that mythical or legendary image of Patanjali. The Sankhya Karika has 72 verses, and its metaphysics consists of these various attributes. Firstly, this division, as I mentioned, into a duality of Prakriti and Purusha. Manifest nature is Prakriti. There is only one Prakriti. That Prakriti is universal. It is nature outside us and inside us. Within it is involved the consciousness of Purusha, or consciousness, witnessing consciousness. Now, according to Sankhya, these are two different principles. It's a dualism. And there are many Purushas but one Prakriti. So it's almost as if every individual and every living creature, but particularly every human individual, is a atomic monad of consciousness that is encased in the sheaths of a universal nature or Prakriti. This universal nature of Prakriti has three qualities or gunas called Sattva, Rajas and Tamas. These are the principles of luminosity, dynamism and inertia. So all things have got these three types of valencies, one may say. And because of these valencies acting in one or the other way, we are subject to these three kinds of operations, or three kinds of ways of experience in us. In the presence of Purusha, the gunas are in disequilibrium, causing evolution. So the idea is that Prakriti by itself has got these three kinds of qualities, and these three qualities are all in equilibrium within it, and it is at rest. It is in a zero state of rest. But as soon as consciousness enters it, these three become disturbed. Now, we may ask the question, why do they become disturbed? If they become disturbed, that means there is some kind of communication that takes place between consciousness and this medium, unconscious medium of qualities. And if there is communication that takes place, there must be some substratum of identity. But this question is not asked or not raised. And again, as with all other yogas, metaphysics in the yoga philosophy field is always pragmatic or practical. It is not an absolute metaphysics. So we find that there is a disequilibrium that results immediately when monad of consciousness is associated with this substratum of Prakriti, of nature. So this disequilibrium causes evolutes to emerge. And these evolutes are trying to become more and more adapted to forms that can come close in some way to the power of Purusha. And there is a borrowed kind of consciousness that they assume from Purusha. And these evolutes are first a Mahat, a universal intelligence, Ahankara or ego, Buddhi or intellect, Manas or the sense mind, the 5 sense organs, the 5 organs of action, the 5 senses, and their relational objective counterparts, the 5 objects of sense. The aim of Sankhya is to identify with pure consciousness or Purusha. So we find that the Sankhya Karika in its culminating stanzas shows us how that is done. And I read you the stanzas in translation. The 64th stanza says, "Thus from the practice of the 24 tattvas," the description of these various elements of Prakriti that we just went through, with the senses, the ego, the intelligence, and the objects of sense, etc., they form 25 elements that are called tattvas. Tattvas literally means thatnesses. Latin has a term quidditas, that is the elemental, elemental, what are called qualities or qualia, elemental qualia. So, thus from the practice of the 25 tattvas, wisdom of the form, there is no sense of being, na asmi, no I am, no sense of possession, na me, no I have, and no sense of person, na aham, no I, arises, which is pure, absolute, and free from error and doubt. 65. By this means Purusha, like a pure witness, beholds nature which has ceased from productivity and from the 7 forms of evolution under influence of its freedom. 66. Purusha has the awareness, she has been seen by me, and becomes indifferent. The other has the awareness, I have been seen, and ceases to act. Even if there is connection, there is no motive for evolution. It's almost as if Prakriti's evolution is a game that is being played for the experience of Purusha. This is how it's actually mentioned, even in the Yoga Sutras. But this delusional play, this play of entertainment of the Purusha, is also something that has an aim. And that aim is that at some point, Purusha sees the player. Who is it that's doing all this play? And as soon as it recognizes the player realizes that the game's up, as the phrase goes, and it feels there's no more point in multiplying appearances, and it stops evolving. And Purusha itself has the sense that I now know what is the game. The game is known by me. It's almost like these chess players who play a game for a few steps, and then in their mind they can see the end of the game. It's inevitable, and they stop the game. So this is the way in which they're talking about the relationship of Purusha and Prakriti, and the awareness coming to a point where Prakriti cannot hold the Purusha anymore, and it escapes from its bondage to Prakriti. Even in my use of such terms as bondage, there is a model of reality that is being followed in the Sankhya, which is, as I said, a practical or pragmatic metaphysics. It is saying that the goal of this particular system is to escape from Prakriti. In other words, Prakriti and its actions are undesirable because they are painful. They cause illusion and delusion in which Purusha is trapped as in a prison. So, how does one get there? And in these three verses, one can see, particularly in verse 64, that the method is given as the practice of the 25 tattvas. What is the practice of the 25 tattvas? It is, as the name of the philosophy is, enumeration. In other words, one casts one's attention successively at each of these 25 qualia, and identifying each one of them says, I am not the Purusha. So it is really a neti process, apophatic process of negative theology by which one identifies these various elements of Prakriti. Having identified all of them is the practice of the 25 tattvas. This practice of the 25 tattvas ends up with wisdom of the form, this three kinds of of ego. One is na asmi, that is, I am not. No, I am. That is the verb itself, the verb of existence itself is kind of erased. Then no me, which is the object, is taken out. I don't have anything. In other words, my objective goal is taken out. And then na aham, that is, the subject is also denied. That each one of these is seen as a construct. The object, the subject, and that which connects the two of them, the sense of existence of the object and subject. All three of them are taken out. So this is exactly the kind of process which allows the Purusha to separate itself from the Prakriti. Now, Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, as we know, is not one of world negation. It is one of world affirmation and world transformation. But he does use Sankhya, and we'll see how he uses Sankhya, but he uses it in a Vedantic way. But he's not the only one or the first one to do that. It has extensively been done before him. And all the Vedanta schools, whether Shaiva schools or Vaishnava schools or the Gita itself, have developed their own kind of Vedantic Sankhya, one may say, which is monistic but utilizes the dualism of Sankhya as a stage in their metaphysics and praxis. So we may see that the yoga school uses a similar kind of process. I mean, actually the process is different, but the metaphysics is the same. So I will not go into that detail. Yoga is the principal text is Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, as we've seen already. And we can see the structure of it. It's also a 4th or 5th century text. But moving on, we'll see one of the schools and how they have made use of it. This is the Vedantic Shaiva version. So Shaivism, there are a number of schools of Shaivism. This is the kind of school that one finds a diagrammatic representation of what is in the Puranas, the Puranic Shaivism. So we find here that division that I spoke of in the Upanishads between Vidya and Avidya. And in the Vidya, you find that absolute Brahman is something which has a certain kind of internal duality as Purusa and Prakruti. So Purusa and Prakruti are two aspects of the Brahman that know themselves to be the Brahman at play with on one another. They are like polarities of the one that cause a certain kind of manifestation to take place between them. But what happens in the kind of world that we live in is that there is a division by Maya between that kind of world of Vidya or knowledge in which Purusha and Prakriti know themselves to be aspects of the one, to the Avidya or ignorance in which Purusha and Prakriti are sundered and appear as a dualistic reality. So this is exactly how Sri Aurobindo will also tackle and utilize Sankhya in some of his formulations as a process by which one can separate consciousness from the automatisms of nature as a step towards transiting to the realm of Vidya from the Avidya, and there finding a reunion between Purusha and Prakriti in the light of Brahman or as aspects of Brahman, and bringing that power back down into the Avidya to transform it. So this is a certain kind of process that we will be looking at in greater detail as we go on further in our study of the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo.